Welcome and good morning. So you are watching Unit 2, Variables and Expressions, and we're going to look at the section title that it says 2.2 Distributive Property with Variables. And these are the pizzazz pages that go with this, so 7, 24, 25, and 26. And please make sure that you put your name and date on these. That would be excellent. Thank you very much. We're going to start out with some vocabulary that we've seen previously in our notes for 2.1 on combining like terms. And the first vocabulary piece we have is term. So term is a simple expression with only multiplication. And a variable is the letter that represents an unknown number or unknown numbers. And we're going to then talk more deeply today about distribute, since this is the distributive property. So to distribute, we need to multiply over addition. So think of mail, that you're distributing the mail to every single person. Or you can think of on Valentine's Day, maybe when you were a child, the teacher sent home a request for every single person to have a Valentine if you were going to give out Valentines. So distributing to each term is really where we're looking. And when we take a look at distributive property the way we've seen it so far with just simply numbers, if I was to take the number 5 times 18, I could then take a look and say this is the same thing as 5 times 10 plus 8, because that's way easier. And so then 5 times 10 plus 5 times 8, let me get there. And now I've all of a sudden made this mental math much easier on my brain. And I can add 50 plus 40 and get 90. Very, without, almost painlessly, I would say, without much mental thought. So using distributive property here, this is with numbers, and we're going to take notes on with variables. So let's go ahead and start with the key concepts. So the first thing I'd like to do is to remember that addition is the same thing as subtraction when we add the opposite. So this is a really important key. Whenever we see subtraction, we really want to change this to adding the opposite fairly quickly so that we don't get confused. Our first key concept that we're going to take a look at is, and let me clear this out just a little, make that a little easier. So our first key concept to look at is to simplify within the grouping symbol. So we want to see if there is a way that we can make this easier, and maybe we don't need to use distributive property. We do that by adding the opposite. So if there is subtraction in there, maybe we want to add the opposite. And also within our grouping symbols, look to simplify. The next piece that we're going to look at is to identify the term that's being distributed. And that's the term that's being multiplied to the group. So either in front of the parentheses or grouping symbols, or right at the back without an operation in between them. So the invisible operation there would be multiplication. So that's why we wrote multiply on the outside. The third step here is to draw arrows from the outside term to each inside term. So we're essentially distributing that outside term to all the things inside. Remember that Valentine example that I gave. And the fourth piece is to simplify any additional terms by using combining like terms. Oh, excuse me. I am ahead of myself. So 4 is to multiply across the arrows and drop grouping symbols. So once we multiply, we can go ahead and drop the grouping symbols. So let's take a moment and review those steps. We have a couple more to go. Now we're going to take a look at step number 5, And step 5 is the combining like terms I was talking about previously when I got ahead of myself. So we want to simplify by adding terms that are like together, if there are terms. So we would box them in just like we did in our notes 2.1. And finally, we're going to arrange the terms with an alphabetical and descending exponential order. So arranging the terms in alphabetical or descending exponential order. And again, reminder from 2.1 that descending means going from the highest to the lowest. And let's go ahead and take a look at some examples with distributive property. Our first example we'll have is going to be 3x plus the quantity 2x plus 6x times 5. So if I take a look at this, I do have a term that's being multiplied on the outside of this parenthesis. But before I even go there, my first step is to look and simplify within the grouping symbols. And lucky for me, I actually have some like terms in here. So I'm not going to have to use the distributive property. When I take a look at this, 2x plus 6x are like terms, and I get 8x when I add them together. I can go ahead and then multiply the 5 and drop down the 3x. This is all I'm doing, is I'm just directly dropping that down. And I'm going to go ahead and then multiply before I add using order of operations. So I'm going to end up with 3x plus 40x. And then my like terms, I have the 3x and the 40x, and add those together to get 43x. That is my answer. The next example we're going to look at has two sets of grouping symbols. And it is 4 times the quantity 2m plus 6 plus 3 times the quantity of 3 plus 7. Now, in this case, one of these, I do have the ability to simplify within the grouping symbol, and then the other one I don't. So the second grouping symbol of 3 plus 7 is where I have those like terms, and 2m plus 6 aren't alike. So I'm going to just remind myself about that. So when they're not like, this is when I get to use the distributive property. So first I'm going to take care of the easy part and use my combining like terms and drop down 3 plus 7 to give me the 10. And drop everything else down and go 4 times the quantity 2m plus 6 plus 3 times 10, which of course is going to simplify to 30. Now I'm going ahead to do the actual distribution. So the 4 is the piece that's being distributed, and I'm going to slow down a little bit on that. The 4 is the piece that's being distributed. So it goes to both terms that are inside. In this case, I only have 2 terms, so it's going to be multiplied to the 2 terms. So I will then multiply 4 times 2m plus 4 times 6 and drop down the plus 30. Then simplifying by multiplying, I get 8m plus 24 plus 30. And this is where I get to combine like terms and then arrange in alphabetical order if necessary. So in order to combine some terms, it looks like the m is all alone. I don't have another term that has an m, but I do have some constants that can be simplified. So the 24 and the 30 can be boxed in. Adding those together, I get 54. And I'm going to go ahead and write 8m plus 54. All right, let's take a look at a couple other examples to help us out. So while this replays, I'm going to pause it so you don't have to rewatch it. And magically, we're back to completing example 1 and example 2. So let's go ahead and take a look at example 3 and get started. So example number 3, we have 14 minus 3 times the quantity 4y minus 1. Now in this case, I am going to look to see if I have any like terms inside the parentheses as my first step, because that's how I'm going to simplify. So I take a look and I don't have like terms, so I do need to distribute. But the trick here is I'm not going to distribute the 3. I'm actually going to distribute the -3. And everywhere I see subtraction, I'm going to want to make it adding the opposite. So really, I'm going to take this -3 and multiply by the 4y, and the -3 and multiply by a -1. Dropping the 14 down, I'm going to do just that now. And I get 14 plus -3 times the quantity 4y plus -3 times -1. Now I get to go ahead and multiply, and I can drop any grouping symbol. So 14 plus -12y plus +3. Do be careful with your signs, because this right here, 2 negatives multiplied gives me a positive. And now we're going to go ahead and combine some like terms. I take a look, and the 14 and the +3 are the two pieces I see that are alike. And the -12y is all by itself. Now, knowing that I want to put this in alphabetical order, I am going to put the -12y first, and then add 14 and 3 together to get 17. So my answer is -12y plus 17. Example number 4 is going to have another situation with 2 distributions. I'm taking a negative and distributing it from the quantity of 12 minus 4x. And it looks like I decided just to make this one distribution. So I'm going to look and say, first of all, my first step is 12 and -4x cannot be simplified. They're not like. And I'm going to go ahead and distribute that negative through. It really is a -1 that's being distributed, because I can multiply, that invisible number is 1 when I'm multiplying. So since it's negative, it's going to be a -1 that's being multiplied. So putting that together, then I'm going to multiply -1 to the 12. And in the parentheses, I'm going to add the opposite to make sure that I'm multiplying to a -4x. So I'm going to put a -1 times 12 plus -1 times -4x. And I'll get -12 plus +4x. This tells me I need to reorganize. So 4x plus -12 is the same thing. I also want you to be aware you can use subtraction here to say 4x minus 12 if you prefer. Now we're going to go ahead and do a couple more examples. One you must do and the other will be optional. When we take a look at that, beforehand we're going to do a preview of what's to come. So your preview of some key concepts, we're going to start with identifying the section title again as 2.2 Distributive Property. And some key concepts for a preview here. We're familiar with exponents for numbers, and variables can also have exponents. For example, 3 times 3 is 3 squared. We're used to that with numbers. And the same applies for variables. We can have m times m, and the result will give us m squared. So if we have 2 terms multiplied together, so 5g times 2g, right here, I can essentially regroup this based on my multiplication commutative property and say that 5 times 2 and g times g is the same thing. So then I will end up with an answer of 10g squared. So with that being the case, this is a preview coming up. We will be using exponents when we're doing this. And the idea here is to take a look at a couple of examples that give us a little bit of what this might look like. So the first example I would like to draw your attention to is -8 times 3u minus 1, so that's the quantity of 3u minus 1, plus 7 times the quantity of 3 minus 2u. Now, we're going to take a look and hopefully if we can simplify inside either of these parenthesis sets, these grouping symbols. And I could not. So that tells me then I can go ahead and look to find the term that I am distributing. And I have two sets that I am distributing. So I'm going to be distributing a -8 in the first and a +7 in the second set. I also want to take a look and notice that I do have some subtraction signs, so I do want to go about making sure that those are adding the opposite and distributing through. So I'm going to start with my arrows and take the -8 and multiply by the 3u and the -1. I'm also going to use the second set and multiply the 7 to the 3 and the 7 to the -2u. From here, I'm going to then simplify, so being able to multiply through, that's going to give me a -24u plus a +8 plus a +21 plus a -14u. Now I've got a couple things that I can combine, so let's make sure that we do that. I'm going to box in the u terms, and I'm going to circle in the constants so that I don't get confused. Putting -24u and -14u together, I'll get a -38u plus a +29. Now this is in alphabetical order, so we are in good shape here. The next thing I'm going to do is do a preview for another example. So in this case, for this example, you do not need to write this down. It is a preview, and I just want to be able to show you. So if I was to distribute a 4a to the quantity a squared minus 2a plus 3, then I get to go ahead and I can circle that and distribute through. The 4a is going to be multiplied to the a squared, the -2a, and the 3. Doing that then, I'm going to simplify because a squared is the same thing as a times a. So this gives me 4 times a to the third plus -8a squared plus 12a. Now this again is just a preview, so I'm not going to go over it in high detail. You do have a couple of try on your own problems to work on tonight, but this preview here for example 6 is just something to kind of play with and be thinking about as we go ahead. So some of the try on your own examples, we have 2 of them for you. I would like you to try and multiply or distribute 5 times the quantity of 2n squared plus n. Again, our first steps are to simplify within the grouping symbols if possible, then to identify the term being distributed, draw arrows from the outside term, multiply the outside term to each inside term, simplify by combining like terms, and arranging in alphabetical order and descending exponential order. The next try on your own problem is taking x plus 9 minus 4 times the quantity of 2x minus 3. Here, my comment to you is to be particularly careful with the subtraction. Thank you so much for your time, and we'll go over these 2 problems and the rest of the notes in class. Thanks for your attention.